When we wrote our person class, we also wrote a method called sayHello. It accepts a string value, and the method concatenates hello and then whatever value we pass to the method. So we could pass Jeremy, and our person object would say hello Jeremy, or we could pass Jeffrey. It would say hello Jeffrey. We could pass coffee maker, and it would say hello coffee maker. And that's not as crazy as it sounds. I say hello to my coffee maker every morning. But it does lend itself to some nonsensical things. But then again, at the same time, we do want to pass a string and have it greet whatever it is that we passed to that method. So the design is okay, but it could be a little better, because let's say that we wanted to say hello to another person object, and that makes perfect sense because people in the real world, we greet one another. So it would be nice if we could emulate that within our code. If we could say hello to another person object, and we can kind of do that. Well, we can do that, but in a roundabout way. We would have to concatenate the first name and the last name properties that we created yesterday. So just to give you an idea, let's create a variable. We'll call this greeting. And John is going to say hello to Jane. So Jane.firstname. Then we will concatenate a space and then concatenate Jane's last name. And then let's write that to the console. And then we will run it, and we will say, hello, Jane Doe. So we can say hello to a person object. It just requires some extra code. And I guess that's okay if we only did it one time, but this is something that we may use over and over and over again. And if we are saying hello to other person objects, this could get a little redundant and a little tedious. So there's got to be a better way to do that, and there is with method overloading. Method overloading is a feature in C#, but it's an object-oriented programming concept. There are other object-oriented languages that allow you to overload methods as well. And to overload a method, you're basically writing a different version of an existing method. So in our person class, we have a sayHello method that accepts a string. Well, we can overload this method by writing another sayHello method that accepts a person object. And to do that, all we have to do is write the code. It needs to have the same return type, and of course it needs to have the same name. But the difference is the parameter. Instead of accepting a string, it's going to accept a person object. And then, of course, the code itself is going to be a little different. We are still going to concatenate hello, but then we are going to use the person's first name and last name properties. So we can go back to program.cs and we can get rid of this code and just replace it with Jane. And then when we run this, we will see, hello, Jane Doe. IntelliSense is also aware of overloads. I think I've shown you before, but just in case if I haven't, we can see that IntelliSense knows that there are two overloads of sayHello. One accepts a person object, and the second accepts a string. And it doesn't matter which one we have selected here. This is just for informational purposes. So we have the string one selected, but I can pass in the person object just fine. Now, the way that we have written our overload has introduced some inefficiency as far as maintenance is concerned. Because let's say that we wanted to change the resulting string of sayHello. Instead of saying hello, we want to say hello there. Well, we would have to make that change in both of these overloads and any other overload that we might have. And while we are making that change, we might miss one or two, or we might make a typo here or there. But the result is basically introducing a bug into our code, and we never want to do that. And we can make our code more efficient as far as maintenance is concerned and less prone to bugs by using a feature of overloading, which is calling an overload from within another overload. And if that's clear as mud, hopefully this code will clear that up a bit. Basically, we are calling the string version of say hello. We are taking the first name and the last name, concatenating those together, and then that's getting passed to our string version of say hello. And this is kind of the most generic version. Everything can be whittled down to a string, basically. So it makes sense to have this kind of our master overload. There's really no such thing as a master. It's just something that I use whenever I'm writing overloads, is I have one master overload, one to rule them all. And then all of my other overloads call that overload, or they might call another overload that makes more sense. But I'm saying overload way too many times in that sentence. But the idea being, we have one overload that does all of the work, and then all of the other overloads call that one to basically make maintenance a whole lot easier. So now all we have to do is make one change, and then that change is reflected in both of the string and the person object versions of say hello. So as long as our methods have different parameter lists, which is what we call a method's signature, then that would be considered as an overload. So we have two overloads, one with a string and one with a person object. If we were going to create another method that had a string parameter, we would get an error. And it doesn't matter what the name of the parameter is, it's the data type of the parameter. So I've renamed name to foo. Other than that, it's the same thing. But Visual Studio isn't giving us an error. In fact, as far as Visual Studio is concerned, this is perfectly fine until we try to run our code. And then we get an error, and we can see a blue squiggly under this second say hello method. And if we look at the error message, it says that person already defines a method called say hello with the same parameter types. So it looks and sees this first method with a string parameter and says, okay, that's fine. Then it looks at this second say hello method with a string parameter and says, uh-oh, we already have one of those. So that's it. We can't have another one. Now we can have a signature with a string and a person object. Even though we have two overloads, one that has a string and one that has a person, we can have one that has a string and a person because that is a different signature. And the same is true for reversing these parameters. Instead of a string person, we could have a person string, and that too would be valid because even though they are the same data types, they are in a different order. So if I run this code, everything's going to be fine. It executes and everything is hunky-dory. Methods aren't the only thing that we can overload. We can also overload constructors because, as I've said before, constructors are special methods. And the same rules apply. The constructor has to have a different signature than the other constructors. So let's be really lenient and allow the creation of a person object with a first name, and only a first name, no last name. So we need to assign the first name property. Now we've run into an issue here that we did with the say hello method, in that we were replicating logic. Within both of these constructors, we are assigning the first name property, and that's not really a big deal as far as this code is concerned. But with more complex classes, especially classes with a lot of overloaded constructors, this could be an issue because we could introduce a bug really, really easy. So we would like to be able to call another constructor from another constructor. That sounds really weird to say, but we can do that. It just looks a little different. We can't do something like person. There we go. Person, first name. We are going to get a red squiggly there. So we are going to use some syntax that's going to look a little weird to you at first, but this syntax is used in other areas, and you'll just get used to it if you're not already. And that is before this code block, right after the closing parentheses, we use a colon and then the keyword this. And whenever we open the parenthesis, we are going to see two overloads, one with just a first name and one with a first name and a last name. Now, naturally, we don't want to use the second overload because that would get us into an endless loop, and that would not be good. But we do want to call the one with the first name because that's the one that we want to do. And so we just simply pass in first name. We don't have a semicolon. We get this first name from the first name parameter of this constructor. So basically we're calling this constructor, and it's taking this first name parameter, calling our overload to set the first name property, and then it executes the rest of this constructor and assigns the last name property. So whenever we run this code, we are going to get the same exact results that we had before. Hello there, Jane Doe. So overloads are a very nice feature. We have made our API more robust. We've allowed the creation of a person object with just a first name while still retaining the ability to create a person with a first name and last name. We've also used a feature of calling overloads to reuse some of the logic that we already have without having to duplicate that logic, like with assigning the first name property, and with the say hello method, returning a string to say hello to something. So tomorrow we are going to look at a feature called default parameters, which somewhat goes hand in hand with overloads. In fact, sometimes default parameters can replace overloads completely, but then there's times that overloads are a more desired approach. So it's a new feature of C#4, and we will take a look at that tomorrow.